When the sun set in a medieval village, fear crept in with the night. Tonight, we walk through the fields and thatched homes of peasants who didn't just avoid the dark, they feared it, with no lamps, no guards, and only whispers to explain. The strange sounds outside, every shadow was a spirit and every creak was a curse. Discover how a world without light became a playground for superstition, silence, and survival. If softly spoken fears and forgotten folklore help quiet your thoughts, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to keep exploring the quiet terrors and twilight tales that once ruled the night, one sleepy step at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You are standing in a medieval peasant's hut as the last traces of daylight fade through the single, unglazed window opening. The year is 1347, somewhere in the English countryside, and you're about to experience what it truly meant to live at the mercy of flame and shadow. As darkness creeps across the packed earth floor beneath your feet, you realize that every flicker of light in this cramped space represents not just illumination, but survival itself. The central hearth before you burns with a mixture of wood and peat, sending irregular shadows dancing across the wattle and daub walls. Christian History Institute. This raised stone platform in the center of the room serves as the beating heart of peasant existence. Yet its light barely reaches the corners where livestock shuffle nervously in their partitioned space. The smoke rises through a crude hole in the thatched roof, but much of it lingers, creating a perpetual haze that stings your eyes and coats every surface with a fine layer of soot. But this fire, insufficient as it seems, represents a luxury that many peasant families could barely afford to maintain. You see, light in medieval times wasn't simply a matter of striking a match or flipping a switch. Every flame came at a cost that had to be carefully weighed against the basic necessities of life. The wood burning in this hearth had to be gathered from the Lord's forest, requiring permission and often payment. History? Hit the peat had to be dug from boggy ground, dried through the summer months, and stored carefully to last through winter's long nights. When you needed additional light beyond what the hearth provided, your options were severely limited and expensive. Candles made from beeswax were completely beyond a peasant's means. BBC Future. A pound of beeswax candles could cost more than 2 days' wages for a master carpenter, making them as unattainable for a peasant as fine jewelry or silk clothing. The wealthy might burn beeswax candles that filled their chambers with pleasant honey scents and steady bright light, but such luxuries belonged to a different world entirely. Instead, you made do with what the medieval economy offered to those at its very bottom: rushlights and tallow candles. The rushlight, perhaps the most humble form of illumination ever devised, required you to gather rushes from marshy ground during the growing season. Wikipedia. These had to be carefully peeled, leaving just one strip of green skin to hold the pith together. The prepared rush was then dipped repeatedly in fat, usually mutton or beef tallow, until it built up a sufficient coating to burn. The process of making rushlights was tedious beyond modern comprehension. You would spend hours by the marsh, cutting rushes with a small knife, then more hours peeling them with practiced fingers that quickly became stained and raw. The fat for dipping came from whatever scraps could be saved from the family's meager meat rations, carefully rendered down over the fire. Each rushlight, when finished, would burn for perhaps 20 to 30 minutes, providing light roughly equivalent to a single birthday candle. William Cobbett, the English essayist, noted that rushlights cost almost nothing to produce, But this statement reveals the perspective of someone who never had to make them himself. Wikipedia. For a peasant family, almost nothing still represented precious time and resources. The hours spent gathering and preparing rushes were hours not spent in the fields or tending livestock. The animal fat used for dipping was fat that could have been eaten or used for cooking. Every economic decision in peasant life involved these stark calculations between competing necessities. Tallow candles offered better light, but at an even steeper cost. These required significant amounts of animal fat, usually from cattle or sheep, which had to be rendered, strained, and carefully formed around a wick. The process demanded not just materials, but skill and time. A poorly made tallow candle would gutter and smoke, wasting precious resources while providing inadequate light. A well-made one might burn for an hour or more, but the amount of fat required represented a substantial portion of a family's total animal resources. Consider the economic reality facing a typical peasant family. They might own a few chickens, perhaps a pig, if they were fortunate, and access to strips of land for growing grain. History hit every ounce of fat from any animal that died had to be carefully allocated between food, soap-making, waterproofing, and lighting. The choice to burn tallow for light meant accepting that much less fat would be available for cooking or preserving food. In a subsistence economy where malnutrition was always just one bad harvest away, such choices carried life or death consequences. The expense of artificial lighting created a rigid hierarchy even among peasants themselves. A family with enough resources to burn tallow candles regularly was noticeably better off than their neighbors who relied solely on rushlights and firelight. This hierarchy extended to the tools used for lighting. Simple rushlight holders made of iron were common, but families who could afford proper candle holders with reflective surfaces were displaying their comparative wealth. Oil lamps represented another option, but one that was often even more expensive than candles. While olive oil was available in Mediterranean regions, in northern Europe the oil had to come from other sources, fish oil, nut oils, or rendered animal fats that were liquid at room temperature. Medieval market. These oils were costly, often rancid, and produced flames that smoked heavily and smelled terrible. A peasant burning fish oil in a simple ceramic lamp would fill their small dwelling with an odor so intense that it competed with the existing smells of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and decomposing straw. The social implications of this lighting hierarchy were profound. When darkness fell, wealthy households would continue their activities by the light of multiple beeswax candles, but peasant families would gradually restrict their activities to whatever could be accomplished by the dying firelight. Reading was impossible for most peasants anyway, but even simple tasks like mending clothes or preparing food became difficult or dangerous once the primary light source diminished. This economic constraint meant that darkness wasn't just an inconvenience for medieval peasants, it was a daily reality that shaped every aspect of their lives. Work stopped when natural light failed, not because of laziness or lack of ambition, but because continuing productive activity would require burning resources that the family simply couldn't afford to waste. The approach of sunset brought with it an enforced idleness that wealthy households never experienced. But the economics of light created dangers that went far beyond mere inconvenience. In a world where most activities stopped at sunset, those who moved about in darkness automatically aroused suspicion. A person walking through a village at night with a light source was either wealthy enough to afford such wasteful consumption or engaged in activities that couldn't wait for dawn. Christian History Institute. Neither possibility was particularly comforting to the peasant families huddled around their dying fires. The very act of maintaining adequate light became a source of constant anxiety. Every rushlight burned represented irreplaceable resources consumed. Every hour that the central fire burned meant fuel that would not be available later in the winter. Peasant families developed elaborate calculations about when lighting was absolutely necessary versus when they could manage in darkness or with minimal illumination. This economic pressure created a peculiar rhythm to peasant life that is almost impossible to understand from a modern perspective. Activities that required good light, sewing, food preparation, tool maintenance, had to be compressed into the daylight hours. As evening approached, families would gradually shift to activities that could be performed by touch or memory, storytelling, simple food preparation, or just sitting quietly together around the fire. The dying of the light each evening wasn't just a natural transition from day to night, it was an economic event that forced immediate decisions about resource allocation. Should they burn another rushlight to continue working, or should they preserve that precious resource for a future emergency? Should they add more fuel to the fire to extend its light, or should they let it die down to conserve wood for tomorrow's cooking? These calculations weren't abstract. They could determine whether a family had adequate heat and light during a winter storm, or whether they would spend those crucial hours in dangerous cold and darkness. Yet even as peasant families made these careful economic calculations about light, they remained acutely aware that their precious flames provided far more than just illumination. In a world where medical knowledge was primitive and disease was rampant, the difference between life and death often came down to maintaining adequate warmth and the ability to prepare hot food. But these life-sustaining benefits of fire brought with them their own terrible risks and responsibilities. What happened when the last ember died, and how did medieval peasants navigate the complex balance between the necessity of fire and the ever-present danger it represented in their highly flammable world? The central hearth of a medieval peasant. Dwelling wasn't merely a convenience, it was a sacred trust passed down through generations, a responsibility so fundamental that its failure could spell doom for an entire family. As you sit beside this raised stone platform, watching the flames flicker in the smoky air, you begin to understand why the maintenance of fire became elevated almost to the level of religious duty in peasant households. The construction of these hearths followed techniques refined over centuries of bitter experience. Christian History Institute. The raised stone base served multiple practical purposes. It elevated the fire above the damp earth floor, improving combustion and reducing the risk of the fire spreading to the straw and rushes scattered around the dwelling. The stones themselves had to be carefully selected. Certain types of rock would crack or explode when heated repeatedly, potentially sending deadly fragments flying through the cramped living space. Around this hearth, the entire rhythm of a family life revolved with clockwork precision. The fire had to be carefully banked each evening with a technique that bordered on art form. Too little attention, and the coals would die completely during the night, leaving the family without heat or the means to cook breakfast. Too much fuel, and the fire might spread to the thatched roof or consume precious wood supplies needed for the following day. The banking process required intimate knowledge of different types of fuel and their burning characteristics. Medievalists net hardwood logs burned slowly and maintained heat longer, but were often too valuable to use carelessly. Peat provided steady heat but required careful arrangement to prevent smouldering that could produce deadly carbon monoxide. Dried dung, commonly used as fuel, needed to be positioned precisely to burn completely without leaving smouldering pockets that might reignite unexpectedly. The person responsible for maintaining the fire, usually the eldest competent woman in the household, developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the behavior of flames. She could tell by the color of the coals whether they would last through the night. She knew by the sound of the fire whether it was getting adequate air circulation. Most importantly, She could sense when the fire was approaching, that critical point where intervention was needed to prevent complete extinction. This knowledge was literally a matter of life and death during winter months. Medieval houses provided virtually no insulation against the cold. History hit the walls of wattle and daub, despite being nearly a foot thick in some cases, offered minimal protection against freezing temperatures. Without a functioning fire, a peasant family could die of hypothermia within hours during severe winter weather. But the fire's life-giving warmth came paired with constant, mortal danger. Medieval peasant dwellings were essentially kindling boxes waiting for ignition. The walls were made of interwoven wooden sticks daubed with mud and straw. The roof was thatched with dried grass or reeds. The floor was covered with loose straw that was changed infrequently. Christian History Institute. A single spark landing in the wrong place could transform a home into an inferno within minutes. The records of medieval coroners provide chilling evidence of how frequently these domestic fires turned deadly. Families would retire for the night, confident that their carefully banked fire was safely contained, only to wake to find their dwelling filled with smoke and flames. Children playing too close to the hearth would accidentally ignite their rough woolen clothing. Adults, exhausted from long days of labor, would make tiny errors in fire management that led to catastrophic consequences. Even more dangerous were the smaller fires that provided additional lighting throughout the dwelling. Rushlights, with their coating of animal fat, would sometimes drip burning material onto the straw-covered floor. Tallow candles, if knocked over by a careless movement in the cramped quarters, could ignite bedding or clothing almost instantly. The simple act of moving a light source from one area to another became a carefully choreographed procedure designed to minimize the risk of accidental ignition. The management of smoke presented another daily challenge that shaped every aspect of peasant domestic life. Christian History Institute. While some hearths were equipped with hoods or funnels to direct smoke upward through the roof, many peasant dwellings simply had a hole cut in the thatch directly above the fire. This crude arrangement meant that much of the smoke remained in the living space, creating an environment that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards. The constant presence of smoke had profound effects on the health and daily routines of peasant families. Eyes would water continuously, making fine work like sewing or food preparation difficult even during daylight hours. Respiratory problems were endemic, with chronic coughs and breathing difficulties affecting virtually every member of peasant households. The smoke also permeated clothing, bedding, and stored food, creating an environment where everything carried the acrid smell of burning wood and peat. Yet this same smoke provided unexpected benefits that made it tolerable despite its obvious drawbacks. The acidic environment created by constant wood smoke helped preserve stored food, particularly meat and fish, hung from the rafters. The smoke also served as a natural insecticide, reducing the populations of fleas, lice, and other parasites that would otherwise have made peasant life even more miserable than it already was. The positioning of sleeping areas within the dwelling had to account for the complex dynamics of heat, smoke, and fresh air circulation. Families would arrange their straw pallets to capture as much warmth as possible from the central fire while avoiding the worst concentrations of smoke. BBC future children, being smaller and more vulnerable to both cold and smoke inhalation, often slept closest to the hearth but required constant monitoring to prevent accidental burns or suffocation. The responsibility for fire maintenance was distributed among family members according to a strict hierarchy based on age, capability, and trust. Young children learned to recognize the different stages of fire development and the warning signs that indicated immediate attention was needed. Adolescents were taught the techniques for safely adding fuel and managing airflow. Adults bore the ultimate responsibility for making the critical decisions about when to bank the fire, how much fuel to use, and how to balance warmth against conservation of precious resources. This hierarchy extended to the social dynamics of the household during the long winter evenings. The person tending the fire held a position of authority that transcended normal family relationships. Even the nominal head of household would defer to the judgment of whoever was managing the flames, understanding that their expertise in this crucial area could determine the survival of the entire family. The tools used for fire management were among the most important possessions in any peasant household. Iron implements for moving burning logs, pokers for adjusting airflow, and tools for banking coals were treasured items passed down through generations. Medieval market. A family that lost their fire tools through accident or theft faced a dramatically increased risk of fire-related disasters. But beyond the immediate practical concerns of heat and light, the central hearth served psychological and social functions that were equally vital to peasant survival. During the long, dark hours of winter evenings, the fire provided a focal point around which family life could continue. Stories were told, simple crafts were practiced, and the social bonds that held rural communities together were strengthened through shared experience around the flames. The hypnotic quality of firelight had a calming effect that helped peasant families cope with the stresses and uncertainties of their harsh existence. The dancing flames provided entertainment in a world where formal entertainment was rare and expensive. The warmth created a small sphere of comfort within the larger hostile environment of medieval rural life. Yet even as families gathered around their precious fires, they remained constantly aware of how precarious their situation truly was. A sudden windstorm could blow sparks onto the thatched roof. A careless child could knock over a light sauce. An adult, exhausted from the day's labor, could make a tiny error in fire management that would have deadly consequences. The very act of going to sleep each night required a level of trust in the fire's behavior that modern people can barely comprehend. Peasant families had to have faith that their carefully banked coals would behave predictably through the dark hours, providing steady heat without flaring up dangerously or dying out completely. This nightly act of faith was repeated thousands of times throughout their lives, with the knowledge that a single miscalculation could result in death by freezing or burning. But the fire's influence extended far beyond the walls of the peasant dwelling itself. The smoke rising from each hearth served as a signal to the broader community, indicating which families were successfully maintaining their fires and which might be in distress. The absence of smoke from a chimney during cold weather was often the first sign that a family was in serious trouble, prompting neighbors to investigate and offer assistance. As the evening progressed and the time approached for the family to settle into their first sleep of the night, the management of the fire became even more critical. Too much heat would make sleep uncomfortable in the cramped quarters, but too little would leave the family vulnerable to the cold that would intensify during the darkest hours before dawn. What mysteries and dangers awaited these peasant families during the long winter nights when they depended entirely on their carefully tended fires to keep death at bay until morning's light returned. The moment when a peasant family's fire died completely during winter represented one of the most desperate emergencies possible in medieval rural life. As you imagine yourself in this situation, huddled in a dark, rapidly cooling dwelling with your family around you, you begin to understand why the maintenance of fire was surrounded by such elaborate precautions and rituals. The process of fire extinction didn't happen suddenly. It was a gradual descent into cold that gave families precious time to recognize the crisis and take emergency action. Medievalists net. The first sign would be the gradual dimming of the red glow from the banked coals. Then the temperature in the dwelling would begin to drop noticeably. causing family members to wake from their sleep and instinctively huddle closer together for warmth. A family that found their fire completely dead faced a series of increasingly desperate options, each carrying its own risks and limitations. The most immediate need was to restore heat as quickly as possible, but medieval peasants couldn't simply light a match or use a lighter to restart their fire. Instead, they had to rely on techniques that were time-consuming, physically demanding, and often unreliable in emergency situations. The most common method for emergency fire starting involved the use of flint and steel, striking sparks into a bundle of specially prepared tinder. Tasting history. This tinder was typically made from charred cloth, dried fungus, or other materials that would catch fire from the smallest spark. However, creating a sustainable flame from these tiny sparks required considerable skill and patience, qualities that were often in short supply when family members were already beginning to suffer from cold exposure. The physical effects of cold on human performance made emergency fire starting even more challenging. As body temperature dropped, fine motor control deteriorated, making the precise movements needed for flint and steel work increasingly difficult. Hands that were already numb from cold would struggle to hold the tools properly or manipulate the delicate tinder materials. What might be a simple 5-minute task under normal circumstances could take an hour or more when performed by cold-affected individuals in a dark emergency situation. If flint and steel failed, families could attempt to create fire through friction methods, but these techniques were extremely demanding physically and had low success rates under the best of circumstances. The bow drill method required prepared materials and considerable upper body strength to maintain the rapid, sustained motion needed to generate enough heat for ignition. English heritage. For peasants who were already weakened by poor nutrition and hard labor, this method often proved impossible when they most desperately needed it to work. Perhaps most frustratingly, many peasant dwellings would still contain substantial amounts of unburned fuel, logs, peat, and other combustible materials that represented significant economic value but were useless without a way to ignite them. A family could literally die of cold while surrounded by enough fuel to keep them warm for weeks, simply because they lacked the means to create the initial flame needed to start the combustion process. The psychological impact of a dead fire was almost as dangerous as the physical effects of cold. BBC Future. The fire served as the emotional center of peasant family life, providing not just warmth and light, but a sense of security and normalcy. When the fire died, families were plunged into a dark, cold environment that felt actively hostile and threatening. Panic and despair could set in quickly, impairing judgment and reducing the likelihood of successful emergency fire-starting efforts. Children were particularly vulnerable during fire emergencies, both physically and psychologically. Their smaller body mass meant they lost heat more rapidly than adults, and their limited understanding of the situation often led to behaviors that made the emergency worse. Young children might cry continuously, using energy and increasing heat loss, or they might try to help with fire-starting efforts in ways that actually hindered the adults' work. The community response to fire emergencies revealed both the strength of peasant social bonds and the limitations imposed by medieval technology and transportation. Christian History Institute neighbors who noticed the absence of smoke from a family's dwelling would often investigate, bringing burning coals or torches that could be used to restart the dead fire. However, this assistance was only possible if the emergency was discovered quickly and if weather conditions allowed safe travel between dwellings. During severe winter storms, when fire emergencies were most likely to occur, community assistance might be impossible to obtain. Heavy snow could make travel between houses dangerous or impossible, leaving families to cope with their crisis alone. High winds could extinguish torches or burning coals being carried from one dwelling to another, preventing the transfer of fire even when neighbors were willing and able to help. The economic consequences of a fire emergency extended far beyond the immediate crisis. History hit emergency. Fire starting often consumed precious materials that families had been carefully hoarding for other purposes. Tinder materials that had taken weeks to prepare might be exhausted in a single desperate night. Iron tools used for striking sparks could be damaged by frantic, repeated use under emergency conditions. More seriously, the stress and sleep deprivation associated with fire emergencies could trigger a cascade of other problems that persisted long after the immediate crisis was resolved. Adults who spent entire nights struggling to restart their fires would be exhausted and less productive during the following day's essential work. This reduced productivity could lead to inadequate food preparation, insufficient fuel gathering, or other failures that made future fire emergencies more likely. The medical consequences of prolonged cold exposure were severe and often permanent. Medieval peasants who survived fire emergencies frequently suffered from frostbite damage to fingers and toes, reducing their ability to perform the fine motor tasks essential for daily survival. Medieval winter survival. Respiratory problems caused by breathing extremely cold air could develop into chronic conditions that plagued individuals for the rest of their lives. Perhaps most tragically, families that successfully survived one fire emergency often found themselves weakened and more vulnerable to subsequent crises. The physical stress of cold exposure, combined with the consumption of emergency supplies and the psychological trauma of the experience, left households less prepared to handle future emergencies. This created a downward spiral where each successive fire crisis was more likely to prove fatal than the last. The seasonal timing of fire emergencies followed predictable patterns that peasant families learned to anticipate with dread. Medieval winter survival. The most dangerous period was typically late winter, when fuel supplies were running low, but cold weather persisted. Families that had carefully managed their resources through the early part of winter might find themselves forced to take increasing risks with fire management as their fuel supplies dwindled. The transition periods between seasons also presented special challenges for fire management. During warm spells in late winter or early spring, families might reduce their fire-tending vigilance, only to be caught unprepared when temperatures dropped again unexpectedly. The irregular heating needs during these transition periods made it difficult to develop consistent routines for fire management. Weather patterns that modern meteorologists can predict days in advance were completely unpredictable to medieval peasants. A sudden cold snap could catch a family with inadequate fuel supplies and poorly banked fires, creating emergency conditions with little warning. The lack of weather prediction meant that peasant families had to maintain emergency preparedness throughout the entire winter season, never knowing when their fire management skills might literally determine their survival. The psychological toll of living with this constant threat of fire emergencies shaped the medieval peasant worldview in profound ways. Every evening brought the awareness that a tiny error in fire management could lead to a desperate struggle for survival before dawn. Every gust of wind or unusual sound during the night might signal the beginning of a crisis that could prove fatal to the entire family. This constant vigilance created a heightened awareness of fire behavior that bordered on the supernatural. Experienced peasant adults could sense subtle changes in their fire's behavior that indicated potential problems hours before they became critical. They developed an almost mystical relationship with their flames, reading meaning into every flicker and spark. The knowledge that fire represented the thin line between life and death during winter months made peasants acutely aware of their vulnerability and dependence on forces beyond their control. A properly maintained fire could sustain a family through the harshest weather, but that same fire was subject to the vagaries of wind, the quality of available fuel, and the small human errors that were inevitable in any system dependent on constant vigilance. Yet even as peasant families struggled with these life-and-death challenges of fire management, they faced another set of terrors that emerged from the darkness beyond their fragile circles of light. When the sun set and natural light failed, the medieval world transformed into something altogether more dangerous and unpredictable, where the very rhythm of sleep and waking followed patterns that modern people would find almost impossible to understand. You are lying on a straw pallet in a medieval peasant's dwelling, your body pressed close to those of your family members for warmth, when you feel yourself naturally awakening in what feels like the middle of the night. But this awakening isn't the result of a disturbance or emergency, it's part of a sleep pattern that governed human existence for millennia, a pattern so fundamental to medieval life that the entire structure of society was built around it. This is your first sleep, and it's about to end exactly as nature intended. BBC Future. For medieval peasants, the night was not a single period of unconsciousness, lasting from sunset to dawn, but rather two distinct sleep periods separated by an hour or more of natural wakefulness. This biphasic sleep pattern wasn't a quaint medieval custom or a sign of primitive living conditions. It was the natural human response to the daily cycle of light and darkness that had governed our species for hundreds of thousands of years. The timing of this sleep cycle followed the seasonal rhythms that dominated medieval life. BBC Future. During winter months, when darkness fell as early as 4 o'clock in the afternoon, peasant families would begin preparing for their first sleep by 7 or 8 in the evening. This wasn't simply a matter of convenience. The cost of artificial lighting made staying awake after sunset an expensive luxury that most peasant families couldn't afford, except in emergencies. The physical act of settling into first sleep was itself a carefully orchestrated family ritual. In the cramped confines of a typical peasant dwelling, sleeping arrangements had to account for warmth, safety, and social hierarchy all at once. Christian History Institute children slept closest to the central hearth, where they could benefit from the fire's warmth but required protection from rolling sparks. Adults arranged themselves to create barriers between the children and the livestock that shared the dwelling space. The straw pallets that served as beds were far from comfortable by modern standards. These crude mattresses were filled with whatever materials were available: straw, dried rushes, rags, or occasionally feathers for the more prosperous families. BBC Future. The straw became compacted quickly, creating uneven surfaces that provided little cushioning against the hard earth floor below. More problematically, these organic materials harbored colonies of insects, mites, and other parasites that made sleep a constant battle against biting and itching. The bedding itself was minimal and precious. Most peasant families owned only 1 or 2 rough woolen blankets that had to be shared among all family members. History. During the coldest winter nights, family members would layer their daytime clothing on top of the blankets, creating makeshift insulation that was often inadequate against the penetrating cold that seeped through the dwelling's crude walls. Despite these challenging conditions, the first sleep came remarkably easily to medieval peasants. The combination of physical exhaustion from long days of manual labor, the natural darkness that began early in the evening, and the absence of artificial stimulation created ideal conditions for rapid sleep onset. BBC Future. Most peasants would fall asleep within minutes of lying down, their bodies gratefully accepting the opportunity for rest after 12 or more hours of demanding physical work. The duration of first sleep varied with the seasons, and, individual family circumstances, but typically lasted between 2 and 4 hours. During the longest winter nights, first sleep might extend from 8 in the evening until midnight or slightly after. During summer months, when daylight lasted much longer, first sleep might be correspondingly shorter, perhaps lasting only 2 hours before the natural awakening occurred. The awakening from first sleep was gradual and gentle, unlike the jarring, alarm-driven awakening that characterizes modern sleep patterns. Medieval peasants would drift naturally toward consciousness, their bodies following circadian rhythms that had evolved over millennia to match the patterns of natural light and darkness. This awakening wasn't accompanied by the grogginess and disorientation that modern people often experience when roused from deep sleep. Instead, it was a smooth transition to a state of quiet alertness. The environmental cues that triggered this awakening were subtle but powerful. The fire that had been carefully banked before first sleep would have burned down to a dim glow, reducing both light and heat in the dwelling. Christian History Institute the body's natural temperature regulation, which drops during sleep, would begin to signal the need for conscious attention to warmth and comfort. Most importantly, the brain's internal clock, undisturbed by artificial lighting, would naturally signal the end of the first sleep period. The social dynamics of this awakening were complex and varied depending on family structure and circumstances. Not every family member would awaken simultaneously. Adults might rouse before children, or one parent might wake while the other continued sleeping. The person who awakened first bore the responsibility of assessing conditions in the dwelling, checking the fire, listening for sounds that might indicate danger, and determining whether circumstances required immediate action or allowed for the leisurely transition into the wakeful period. This natural awakening process was so fundamental to medieval life that it was incorporated into religious and social institutions. BBC Future monasteries organized their prayer schedules around the assumption that people would naturally awaken in the middle of the night. The church service of matins was specifically timed to coincide with this period of natural wakefulness, allowing the faithful to fulfill their religious obligations during a time when consciousness came easily rather than requiring forced awakening. The quality of sleep during the first sleep period was generally excellent, despite the challenging physical conditions. The combination of genuine exhaustion, natural darkness, and the absence of mental stimulation allowed medieval peasants to achieve deep, restorative sleep that modern sleep researchers recognize as crucial for physical and mental health. This high-quality sleep was essential for peasants who faced demanding physical labor every day and couldn't afford the reduced performance that comes with sleep deprivation. The breathing patterns during first sleep followed natural rhythms that were undisturbed by the shallow, interrupted sleep that characterizes much of modern urban life. The constant presence of wood smoke in peasant dwellings, while unhealthy in many ways, may have actually promoted deeper sleep by creating a mild sedative effect similar to what modern aromatherapy attempts to achieve. Dreams during first sleep were reportedly more vivid and memorable than those experienced during other sleep periods. BBC Future medieval accounts frequently mention dreams that occurred during first sleep, suggesting that this period was particularly conducive to the type of REM sleep associated with dreaming. These dreams often carried significance in medieval culture, where dream interpretation was considered an important source of guidance and prophetic insight. The physical positioning during first sleep was carefully arranged to maximize both warmth and safety. Families would huddle together in configurations that had been refined through generations of cold winter nights. Christian History Institute. The largest adults would position themselves on the outside edges of the sleeping group, creating a barrier against cold drafts, while smaller children nestled in the center where body heat would be most concentrated. Clothing worn during sleep was typically the same rough garments worn during the day, perhaps with the addition of extra layers if the family possessed them. The concept of specialized sleeping attire was unknown to medieval peasants, who owned too few garments to dedicate any specifically to sleep. This meant that sleep was often accompanied by the discomfort of rough wool against skin, the restriction of daytime clothing, and the gradual accumulation of body odors that couldn't be addressed through regular bathing. The sounds that accompanied first sleep were distinctly different from those of modern urban environments. Instead of traffic, electronic devices, and mechanical systems, medieval peasants fell asleep to the sounds of animals shifting in their shared quarters, wind through thatched roofs, and the settling of wooden structures as temperatures dropped. BBC Future. These natural sounds created an acoustic environment that was generally conducive to deep sleep, though sudden weather changes or unusual animal behavior could trigger immediate awakening when they signaled potential danger. The temperature. Regulation during first sleep required constant unconscious adjustment. As the fire burned down and air temperatures dropped, sleeping bodies would naturally move closer together, seeking warmth through shared body heat. This process happened gradually and instinctively, with family members adjusting their positions throughout the sleep period without fully awakening. The transition from first sleep to wakefulness was marked by a growing awareness of bodily needs that had been suppressed during unconsciousness. The most immediate and universal need was urination, which had to be addressed despite the cold and darkness. Medieval peasants would urinate directly into the central fire if possible, as the heat would quickly vaporize the liquid and eliminate odors. BBC Future. This practice, shocking by modern standards, was a practical solution to the challenges of waste disposal in cramped winter quarters. As awareness gradually increased during the awakening process, other physical needs would assert themselves. Hunger was common, as the peasant diet was often inadequate in both quantity and nutritional content. Thirst might require attention, though water sources could be frozen during winter, and accessing them meant venturing into the cold darkness. Outside the dwelling, pain from injuries, arthritis, or the general wear of hard physical labor often became more noticeable during these quiet moments of awakening. The mental state during this awakening process was characterized by a particular type of consciousness that modern people rarely experience. Without artificial lighting to immediately activate full alertness, medieval peasants existed in a twilight state of awareness that was neither fully asleep nor completely awake. BBC Future. This state was conducive to reflection, prayer, and the kind of quiet contemplation that busy daytime hours rarely allowed. The awakening from first sleep also triggered an assessment of conditions both inside and outside the dwelling. Experienced adults could determine from the behavior of the fire whether fuel needed to be added immediately or could wait until later. They could gauge temperature changes that might indicate weather shifts requiring preparation. Most importantly, they could listen for sounds that might indicate danger, unusual animal behavior, human movement outside the dwelling, or weather conditions that posed immediate threats. This natural awakening process was so reliable and predictable that medieval society built important institutions around it. Night watchmen in towns and villages timed their rounds to coincide with the period when most citizens would be naturally awake and alert. Curfew bell, legal proceedings, and official announcements were sometimes scheduled for this midnight period when people could be expected to be conscious without the need for artificial awakening. The communal aspect of first sleep awakening created opportunities for quiet conversation and intimacy that the busy daylight hours rarely provided. Family members might share concerns, make plans, or simply enjoy the rare luxury of uninterrupted time together. BBC Future. These conversations were conducted in whispers to avoid disturbing those family members who might still be sleeping, creating an atmosphere of conspiracy and closeness. But this gentle awakening from first sleep was just the beginning of a complex nocturnal ritual that would occupy the next several hours. The period that followed, known as the watch, would prove to be one of the most important and dangerous times in the medieval peasant's daily cycle. What activities filled these mysterious midnight hours, and why did medieval peasants consider this wakeful period not just normal but essential to their survival and well-being? As you lie in the dim glow of banked coals, having naturally awakened from your first sleep, you enter into what medieval peasants called the watch, a period of conscious activity that was as essential to survival as the sleep periods that bracketed it. This wasn't a time of restless insomnia or sleeping difficulty, but rather a natural and expected part of the daily cycle that served crucial practical, social, and spiritual functions. The watch typically lasted between 1 and 3 hours, depending on the season, family circumstances, and individual variations in sleep patterns. BBC Future. During the longest winter nights, the watch might begin around midnight and continue until 2 or 3 in the morning. During summer months, when total darkness was much shorter, the watch period was correspondingly compressed, but maintained its essential character and functions. The lighting during the watch was minimal and carefully managed. Most families relied primarily on the dim glow from their banked fires, supplemented occasionally by rushlights or simple oil lamps when specific tasks required better illumination. BBC Future. This low level of lighting was actually crucial to maintaining the natural sleep cycle. Bright artificial light would have disrupted the body's circadian rhythms and made the return to second sleep much more difficult. The first priority during the watch was always fire maintenance. The person designated as the primary firekeeper, usually an adult woman with experience in managing combustion, would carefully assess the state of the banked coals and determine what action was needed. Christian History Institute. This might involve adding small amounts of fuel to maintain heat through the remaining hours of darkness, adjusting the arrangement of burning materials to ensure proper airflow, or banking the fire more securely if the night was proving warmer than expected. The fire maintenance during the watch required a delicate balance between competing needs. Too much attention to the fire could create excessive heat and light that would interfere with the family's return to sleep. Too little attention could allow the fire to die completely, creating a potentially fatal emergency during the coldest hours before dawn. The firekeeper had to judge not only current conditions but also anticipate how temperatures and wind patterns might change during the remaining hours of darkness. Beyond fire maintenance, the watch provided essential time for addressing bodily needs that couldn't be ignored during sleep. BBC Future urination was nearly universal during this period, often accomplished by adults stepping to the edge of the dwelling or, when weather was severe, urinating directly into the fire to minimize exposure to cold. Children might require assistance with this process, particularly during harsh weather when leaving the warmth of the sleeping area posed risks. The watch also provided crucial time for addressing pain and discomfort that accumulated during the day's hard labor. Medieval peasants suffered from chronic injuries, arthritis, and the general wear of physical work without access to effective pain management. History. During the quiet hours of the watch, they could massage sore muscles, adjust clothing or bedding to relieve pressure points, or apply simple remedies like heated stones to areas of particular pain. Food consumption during the watch was common, though it was usually limited to simple items that didn't require cooking. Families might share preserved bread, dried fruits, nuts, or other foods that could be eaten without creating light or heat that would disturb the sleep cycle. BBC Future. These midnight meals served both nutritional and social functions, providing calories needed to maintain body heat during cold nights while creating opportunities for quiet family interaction. The work activities conducted during the watch were carefully chosen to be productive without being disruptive to sleep patterns. Women might work on spinning, combing wool, or other textile activities that could be performed largely by feel, in dim light. BBC Future men might sharpen tools, repair equipment, or prepare materials for the following day's work. These activities provided practical benefits while helping to pass the time during the wakeful period. The social dynamics of the watch were particularly important for family cohesion and communication. During busy daylight hours, there was little opportunity for quiet conversation or the sharing of concerns and plans. The watch provided a rare opportunity for adults to discuss household matters, share worries about crops or livestock, or make decisions about family affairs. BBC Future. These conversations were conducted in whispers to avoid disturbing sleeping family members, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and conspiracy. Sexual activity was considered particularly appropriate during the watch, and medieval medical texts specifically recommended this timing for couples hoping to conceive. BBC Future. The quiet hours after first sleep were believed to be the optimal time for conception, when the body was rested but not yet exhausted by the day's labours. The privacy provided by darkness and the sleeping of other family members made the watch the most suitable time for intimate activities in the cramped quarters of peasant dwellings. Religious observances during the watch were extremely important to medieval peasants, reflecting both genuine faith and the social expectations of a deeply Christian society. Many families would recite prayers, particularly the Rosary, during the quiet hours of the watch. BBC Future. The darkness and solitude were considered conducive to meditation and spiritual reflection, allowing peasants to fulfill religious obligations while experiencing a sense of direct connection with the divine. The Church actively encouraged these midnight devotions, recognizing that the natural wake period provided an ideal opportunity for prayer and spiritual discipline. Monastic communities built their entire schedule around the assumption that people would naturally awaken during the night, scheduling the service of matins specifically for this period. BBC Future. Even peasants who couldn't attend formal church services could participate in the spiritual life of the community through their private midnight prayers. The intellectual activities during the watch were limited by illiteracy and the lack of reading materials, but they were nonetheless important for mental stimulation and cultural transmission. Storytelling was common, with older family members sharing folk tales, family histories, and moral lessons with younger listeners. BBC Future. These stories served multiple functions: entertainment during the long dark hours, education for children who had no formal schooling, and preservation of cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost. The watch provided essential time for planning and problem-solving that the busy daylight hours rarely allowed. Peasants could think through challenges they were facing, plan their work for the following day, or consider solutions to ongoing problems with crops, livestock, or household management. BBC Future. This quiet reflection time was crucial for the mental planning that efficient farm management required. The timing of different activities during the watch followed informal but widely understood conventions. The first part of the watch was typically devoted to immediate needs, fire maintenance, addressing bodily functions, and assessing current conditions. The middle period might be used for work activities, food consumption, or social interaction. The final portion of the watch was often dedicated to spiritual activities and preparation for the return to sleep. Weather monitoring during the watch was a crucial survival skill that could determine whether a family was prepared for dangerous conditions that might develop before dawn. Medievalists.net. Experienced peasants could detect subtle changes in wind patterns, temperature, or humidity that indicated approaching storms. This information allowed them to take protective measures, securing loose materials, bringing vulnerable livestock closer to shelter, or adjusting fire management to ensure adequate fuel for emergency heating. The acoustic environment during the watch was distinctly different from both daytime and sleeping periods. Without the busy sounds of daily work or the deep quiet of sleep, the watch was characterized by subtle sounds that required careful interpretation. BBC Future normal sounds included the settling of the dwelling as temperatures changed, the movement of animals in their quarters, and the occasional crackling of the fire. Unusual sounds required immediate attention, as they might indicate everything from minor problems to serious emergencies. The development of listening skills during the watch was essential for survival in a world where many dangers first announced themselves through sound. Peasants learned to distinguish between the normal movements of their own livestock and the sounds that might indicate predators or thieves. They could identify weather patterns by the sound of wind through the thatch or the behavior of animals. Most importantly, they could detect the subtle changes in fire behavior that might signal the need for immediate intervention. The psychological benefits of the watch were as important as its practical functions. The period provided a natural break in the stress and demands of medieval peasant life, offering time for relaxation and mental restoration that was otherwise unavailable. BBC Future. The quiet darkness created an environment conducive to stress relief and emotional processing, helping peasants cope with the hardships and uncertainties of their daily existence. But the watch was not without its own dangers and challenges. The darkness that provided privacy and spiritual atmosphere also concealed threats that could emerge without warning. The reduced alertness that comes with natural nighttime wakefulness made families vulnerable to dangers that they might easily detect during full daylight consciousness. As the watch period gradually drew to a close and family members prepared to return to their second sleep, they remained acutely aware that the darkest and most dangerous hours of the night still lay ahead. What new terrors would emerge during the final hours before dawn, and how did medieval peasants protect themselves during the most vulnerable period of their daily cycle? As the watch period draws to a close and you prepare to settle back into your second sleep, you become acutely aware that the most dangerous hours of the medieval night still lie ahead. The transition from wakefulness back to sleep during these pre-dawn hours was fraught with anxieties and practical challenges that could determine whether your family would survive to see another day. The second sleep, lasting from roughly 2 or 3 in the morning until dawn, occurred during what medieval peasants recognized as the most threatening period of the entire 24-hour cycle. BBC Future temperatures reached their lowest point during these hours, putting maximum stress on the family's heating systems and fuel supplies. Weather conditions were most likely to deteriorate suddenly, catching sleeping families unprepared for emergencies. Most ominously, the deep darkness before dawn was considered the time when supernatural dangers were most active and human defenses were weakest. The preparation for second sleep required even more careful attention to fire management than the earlier banking before first sleep. The fire had now been burning for many hours and had consumed much of the easily combustible material. Christian History Institute. The coals remaining were precious and required expert handling to ensure they would provide adequate heat through the coldest hours, while lasting until dawn when new fuel could be safely added. The firekeeper faced a complex calculation during this critical period. Adding too much fuel could create a dangerous flare-up that might ignite the dwelling's thatched roof, but too little fuel could allow the fire to die completely during the coldest part of the night. The quality of available fuel became crucial during these hours. Hardwood coals burned longer and more predictably than softwood, but peasant families often had to make do with whatever materials they had been able to gather or could afford. The arrangement of the family for second sleep had to account for the increased cold that would develop before dawn. Children were moved even closer to the central hearth, often sleeping in arrangements that would have been uncomfortably warm earlier in the evening. BBC Future adults positioned themselves to act as windbreaks, protecting the most vulnerable, family members from drafts that became more penetrating as outside temperatures dropped. The clothing arrangements for second sleep often involved adding every available garment to the sleeping pile. Families would layer their few changes of clothing on top of the sleeping group, creating makeshift insulation that might mean the difference between survival and hypothermia. History. Hit the rough wool that was uncomfortable during earlier hours now became precious protection against the life-threatening cold. The transition into second sleep was often more difficult than the earlier sleep onset. The period of wakefulness during the watch, while natural and beneficial, had activated mental processes that didn't always settle easily back into unconsciousness. Worries about fuel supplies, concerns about weather conditions, and awareness of the approaching dawn created a level of anxiety that could interfere with sleep onset. The quality of second sleep was generally lighter and more interrupted than first sleep. The combination of cold, physical discomfort, and survival anxiety meant that family members remained partially alert to sounds and sensations that might indicate developing problems. BBC Future. This semi-conscious state was actually adaptive, allowing for rapid response to emergencies while still providing some of the rest that exhausted bodies desperately needed. Dreams during second sleep were reportedly more anxious and disturbing than those experienced during first sleep. Medieval accounts frequently describe nightmares occurring during these pre-dawn hours, often involving themes of cold, darkness, supernatural threats, or family danger. BBC Future. These dreams may have reflected the genuine dangers of the period, as the unconscious mind processed real threats that the conscious mind was trying to ignore in order to achieve rest. The breathing patterns during second sleep were often affected by the increasingly cold air and the smoke that accumulated as air circulation decreased during the night. Many peasants developed chronic respiratory problems that were exacerbated during these cold, smoky hours. The combination of cold air and wood smoke could trigger coughing fits that disrupted sleep for entire families crowded into small spaces. The physical positioning during second sleep required constant, unconscious adjustment as temperatures continued to drop. Bodies would gradually migrate closer together throughout the night, creating tight clusters of shared warmth. By dawn, families often found themselves pressed together so closely that individual movement was nearly impossible without disturbing others. The monitoring responsibilities during second sleep fell primarily to the adults who remained most alert to potential dangers. These designated watchers maintained a state of semi-consciousness that allowed them to assess fire conditions, listen for threatening sounds, and gauge temperature changes without fully awakening. BBC Future. This vigilance was exhausting and contributed to the chronic fatigue that characterized medieval peasant life. Weather emergencies were most likely to develop during the second sleep period, when families were least prepared to respond quickly. Sudden windstorms could blow sparks onto thatched roofs or extinguish fires entirely. Heavy snow could block doors and windows, trapping families inside dwellings with limited air circulation. Medievalists.net. Ice storms could make it impossible to venture outside for additional fuel or emergency assistance. The timing of second sleep had to account for the approaching need to resume daily work activities. Peasant families couldn't afford to sleep past dawn as their survival depended on maximizing productive daylight hours. History. This meant that second sleep often felt rushed and inadequate, particularly when fire emergencies or weather problems had disrupted the earlier sleep periods. The awakening from second sleep was typically less gentle than the natural awakening that ended first sleep. The approach of dawn meant that work activities had to begin regardless of how well the family had slept during the night. Cold, exhausted family members had to rouse themselves and immediately begin the tasks necessary for daily survival, rekindling the fire, preparing food, and assessing conditions outside the dwelling. The transition from sleep to full wakefulness during these pre-dawn hours was often complicated by the effects of cold and carbon monoxide exposure. Peasant families sleeping in poorly ventilated spaces with burning fires often experienced symptoms similar to mild carbon monoxide poisoning, headaches, confusion, and delayed reaction times. Christian History Institute. These effects made the morning awakening process more difficult and potentially dangerous. The assessment of conditions at dawn required immediate attention to multiple critical factors. The state of the fire determined whether the family would have heat and cooking capability for the day. Weather conditions outside affected whether planned work could proceed or whether emergency preparations were needed. The health and alertness of family members determined their capacity for the demanding physical labor that lay ahead. The dawn period was also when the previous night's survival became evident. Families that had successfully navigated the dangers of darkness could begin another day with confidence, but those who had experienced fire emergencies, weather problems, or health crises faced the day already compromised and vulnerable. BBC Future. The cumulative effects of poor nights could create downward spirals that made subsequent nights even more dangerous. The seasonal variations in the timing of dawn created additional challenges for managing the sleep cycle. During winter, month's dawn came very late, requiring families to maintain their fires and endure cold for many hours. During summer, dawn came early, truncating the second sleep period and creating sleep deprivation that had to be managed through afternoon rest periods when possible. The community aspects of dawn awakening included the informal monitoring that occurred as families began their daily activities. The appearance of smoke from chimneys served as a signal that families had successfully survived the night. Christian History Institute. The absence of smoke from any dwelling prompted immediate investigation, as it might indicate that a family was in distress and needed assistance. The religious significance of surviving another night was profound for medieval peasants who understood their mortality in immediate, practical terms. Many families began each day with prayers of thanksgiving for their survival and requests for protection during the coming day. BBC Future. The successful completion of the sleep cycle wasn't taken for granted. It was recognized as a small miracle that required divine assistance. The psychological impact of completing another night cycle was significant for peasant families who lived constantly aware of their vulnerability. Each dawn represented a small victory over the forces of cold, darkness, and danger that threatened their existence. This daily experience of survival against odds created a worldview that was simultaneously fatalistic and resilient. Yet even as medieval peasant families celebrated their survival through another night of natural dangers and domestic challenges, they remained acutely aware that darkness brought threats far more terrifying than cold or fire. When the sun set and shadows lengthened across the medieval landscape, real predators emerged from the forests and wastelands, bringing with them dangers that no amount of careful fire management or vigilant watching could completely prevent. You are standing at the edge of a medieval village as dusk settles over the countryside, and you can hear them before you see them. The low, haunting howls that rise from the dark forests surrounding this small collection of humble dwellings. These are not the romantic wolf calls of modern nature documentaries, but the sounds that struck genuine terror into the hearts of medieval peasants who understood with deadly clarity that nightfall brought real predators to their very doorsteps. The wolves of medieval Europe were not the scattered, endangered remnants that barely survive in today's protected wilderness areas. Why medieval wolves were hunted? They were abundant, bold, and increasingly desperate as human settlements expanded into their traditional hunting grounds. These were large, powerful animals that had learned to associate human habitation with easy prey, not just livestock, but human beings themselves, particularly the vulnerable populations that made up the majority of medieval rural communities. The wolf populations of medieval Europe were maintained by an abundance of food sources that no longer exist today. Wolf attacks. Wikipedia. Battlefields provided regular feasts of carrion, training wolves to associate human scent with food rather than danger. Poor sanitation in villages meant that animal waste and food scraps created attractive feeding opportunities near human dwellings. Most importantly, the widespread practice of leaving human dead in shallow graves or exposed burial sites provided wolves with experiences of human flesh that broke down their natural fear of our species. During the harsh winter months, when natural, prey became scarce and desperation drove predators to extreme measures, wolf attacks on human settlements became not just possible but probable. Wolves around Paris. The wolves learned that human villages contained concentrated sources of food, livestock kept in poorly protected enclosures, food stores that could be accessed through flimsy walls, and human beings who were often too weak from malnutrition to offer effective resistance. The most terrifying aspect of wolf behavior for medieval peasants was their intelligence and adaptability. Unlike other predators that relied primarily on strength or stealth, wolves demonstrated problem-solving abilities that allowed them to overcome human defenses with frightening efficiency. Wolf Attack Wikipedia. They would test different approaches to village defenses, learning from failed attempts and sharing successful strategies with pack members. They could distinguish between armed and unarmed humans, targeting the most vulnerable individuals during their attacks. The seasonal patterns of wolf aggression followed rhythms that medieval peasants learned to dread with the approach of each. Winter. During summer months, when wild game was abundant and the living was relatively easy, wolves maintained their distance from human settlements, content to hunt in their traditional territories. Fear of wolves in Germany, but as autumn progressed and winter approached, the same wolves that had seemed manageable during warmer months became increasingly bold and desperate. The physical description of medieval wolves recorded in contemporary accounts reveals animals that were significantly larger and more formidable than their modern descendants. These wolves had access to abundant nutrition from battlefields, hunting grounds, and human settlements, allowing them to reach sizes that would be considered exceptional today. List of wolf attacks. Adult males could weigh well over 100 pounds, with powerful jaws capable of crushing bones and tearing through the crude leather and wooden defenses that peasants used to protect themselves. The pack behavior of medieval wolves was particularly terrifying because it demonstrated coordination and planning that medieval people had no effective way to counter. Reddit. Wolf discussion. A typical pack would conduct reconnaissance of a village over several nights, testing defenses and identifying vulnerable points. They would coordinate their attacks to overwhelm human defenders, with some pack members creating diversions while others focused on specific targets. The most documented and terrifying wolf attacks in medieval Europe occurred around major population centers where large numbers of wolves had learned to exploit human resources. Reddit. Paris wolves. The siege of Paris by wolf packs during the 1400s represented the extreme end of this predator-human conflict, where organized groups of wolves essentially controlled access to one of Europe's largest cities during winter months. The wolves that terrorized Paris were led by an enormous male that contemporary accounts named Corto, described as larger than any wolf seen before or since. Reddit. Paris wolves. This pack was credited with hundreds of human deaths and demonstrated tactical sophistication that approached military organization. They would block roads, surround buildings, and conduct coordinated attacks that overwhelmed even well-armed defenders. The impact of wolf predation on medieval village life extended far beyond the immediate physical danger, though that danger was substantial enough. List of wolf attacks. Entire economic systems had to be restructured around the reality of wolf predation. Livestock could not be pastured safely without constant human supervision. Travel between villages became extremely dangerous after dark, isolating communities and preventing the trade and communication that rural areas desperately needed. The agricultural implications of wolf predation were devastating for peasant families, who depended on livestock for survival. Medieval outlaws. A single wolf attack could destroy a family's entire livestock holding, chickens, pigs, sheep, or goats, that represented years of careful husbandry and the difference between survival and starvation. Unlike modern farmers who can rely on insurance or government assistance, medieval peasants who lost livestock to wolves faced immediate and often terminal economic disaster. The defensive strategies that medieval villages developed in response to wolf predation reveal both the seriousness of the threat and the limited resources available to combat it. Village walls were strengthened and heightened specifically to deter wolf attacks, but these improvements required resources that most peasant communities could barely afford. Village dangers guard duty became a constant necessity, with adult males taking turns throughout the night to watch for approaching predators. The weapons available to medieval peasants for wolf defense were often inadequate for the task. Simple agricultural tools, scythes, pitchforks, and wooden clubs were no match for large, coordinated wolf packs. Reddit wolf attacks, bows and arrows, while more effective, required skills and materials that many peasants couldn't afford to develop or maintain. Professional weapons like swords or crossbows were beyond the economic reach of most rural families. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of wolf attack created a pervasive anxiety that shaped every aspect of medieval peasant behavior. Children learned from infancy that darkness meant danger, that certain sounds required immediate response, and that survival depended on constant vigilance. Fear of wolves, adults developed hypervigilance that made normal rest and relaxation nearly impossible during winter months when wolf activity peaked. The timing of wolf attacks followed patterns that medieval peasants learned to anticipate with dread. The most dangerous periods were the hours just after sunset and immediately before dawn, when wolves were most active and human visibility was most limited. Wolf Attack Wikipedia. These were also the times when peasants were most vulnerable, transitioning between day and night activities, moving between buildings, or attending to livestock that couldn't be brought inside. The social implications of wolf predation created divisions within medieval communities that could prove as dangerous as the wolves themselves. Families with resources to build better defenses or higher protection gained significant advantages over their neighbors, creating resentment and social tension. Medieval outlaws. Decisions about when to risk travel or whether to provide mutual aid during wolf attacks became sources of conflict that could fragment the community cooperation essential for survival. The interaction between wolf predation and other medieval dangers created cascading effects that multiplied the threat to peasant survival. Villages under wolf siege became more vulnerable to human bandits who could exploit the chaos and distraction caused by predator attacks. Medieval outlaws' families focused on wolf defense might neglect fire safety or food preservation, creating secondary crises that could prove equally deadly. The documentation of wolf attacks in medieval records reveals the bureaucratic response to what was clearly recognized as a major threat to public safety and economic stability. List of wolf attacks. Local authorities offered bounties for wolf kills, organized hunting expeditions, and developed legal frameworks for dealing with wolf-related property damage. The fact that these measures were codified in law demonstrates that wolf predation was not an occasional problem, but a constant feature of medieval life. The seasonal migration patterns of medieval wolf populations brought terror to different regions in predictable cycles. As winter approached and food became scarce in wilderness areas, entire wolf populations would move toward human settlements, creating waves of attacks that swept across the countryside. Wolf threat in France. Peasant communities would share information about approaching wolf packs, but their limited communication systems meant that warnings often arrived too late to be useful. The breeding cycles of wolves also created periods of heightened danger that medieval peasants learned to anticipate with particular dread. Adult wolves with cubs to feed became more aggressive and willing to take risks that they would normally avoid. Wolf attack. Patterns. Young wolves learning to hunt often targeted easier prey like children or livestock, creating additional unpredictable threats that required constant vigilance. The impact of wolf predation on medieval childhood was profound and lasting. Children who survived wolf attacks often bore physical and psychological scars that affected them for life. Medieval village dangers. More broadly, the constant threat of wolf attack shaped childhood development in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Children learned to move quietly, respond instantly to adult commands, and recognize danger signs that could mean the difference between life and death. The educational systems that developed around wolf awareness were as essential as any formal schooling that medieval children might receive. Young people learned to identify wolf tracks, interpret different types of howls, and recognize the behavioral patterns that indicated approaching attacks. Fear of wolves in Germany. This knowledge was passed down through generations as a survival skill, more important than literacy or mathematics. The religious implications of wolf predation created theological challenges that medieval Christianity struggled to address satisfactorily. If God was protective and benevolent, why did he allow such terrible predators to terrorize his faithful servants? Medieval superstitions. The Church's response often involved interpreting wolf attacks as divine punishment for sin or as tests of faith, explanations that provided little comfort to families who had lost members to predators. The economic costs of wolf predation extended far beyond the immediate loss of livestock or human life. Villages had to invest significant resources in defensive measures, walls, guards, weapons, and warning systems that diverted labor and materials from productive activities, banditry, and wildlife. The constant state of vigilance required for wolf defense reduced productivity and created chronic stress that affected every aspect of community life. The technological limitations of medieval society made effective wolf control nearly impossible with available resources. Peasant communities lacked the coordinated military capacity needed to eliminate wolf populations or even significantly reduce them. Wolf hunting medieval individual families or small groups could defend against isolated attacks, but they had no way to address the larger ecological and population dynamics that made wolf predation an ongoing threat. But the wolves, terrifying as they were, represented only one category of predator that emerged from the darkness to threaten medieval peasant communities. Human predators, bandits, outlaws, and criminals posed threats that were often more dangerous than any natural predator because they combined the intelligence and planning ability of humans with the moral abandon of those who had chosen to live outside the protection and constraints of civilized society. What happened when darkness brought not just animal predators but human ones who understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities of medieval peasant life? As darkness settles over the medieval countryside, a different and arguably more terrifying form of predator emerges from the forests and wasteland that surround isolated peasant villages. These are not wolves driven by simple hunger, but human beings who have chosen to survive by preying upon their own species, bandits, outlaws, and criminals who understood precisely how to exploit the vulnerabilities that darkness imposed upon medieval rural life. The bandit populations of medieval Europe were not simply common criminals engaged in opportunistic theft. Medieval outlaws, they were often well-organized groups that operated with military precision, using intelligence networks, coordinated tactics, and detailed knowledge of their target communities. Many bandits were former soldiers who had turned their military training to criminal purposes, bringing professional expertise to what might otherwise have been disorganized criminal activity. The legal system of medieval Europe actually created many of its own outlaws through harsh justice that offered few alternatives to criminal life. A person declared an outlaw, literally outside the law, lost all legal protection and could be killed by anyone without penalty. Wolf's head law, they were said to carry a wolf's head, meaning they could be hunted and killed like wild animals. This system, intended to deter crime, often forced people into permanent criminal careers because they had no legal way to return to society. The economics of banditry were brutal but logical within the context of medieval survival. Banditry on roads. For people without land, trade skills, or other legitimate means of survival, preying on others represented one of the few available economic strategies. The rewards could be substantial. A successful attack on a merchant caravan or prosperous village could provide more resources than a peasant family might accumulate in years of honest labor. The target selection strategies employed by medieval bandits revealed sophisticated understanding of rural economics and social structure. Bandits focused their attention on targets that offered maximum reward with minimum risk. Isolated farmsteads with no nearby assistance, traveling merchants carrying valuable goods, and seasonal workers transporting wages or trade goods. Dangers of travel. They avoided well-defended settlements and targets that might bring organized retaliation. The timing of bandit attacks was carefully calculated to exploit the vulnerabilities that darkness imposed on medieval society. Night attacks offered multiple advantages: reduced visibility that favored attackers who knew the terrain, the element of surprise against sleeping or unprepared victims, and the practical impossibility of immediate assistance from neighboring communities. Medieval banditry bandits understood that darkness was their most powerful ally. The weapons and tactics employed by medieval bandits were often superior to anything available to their peasant victims. Many bandits were equipped with professional military weapons, swords, crossbows, and armor that peasants could never afford to obtain or maintain. Medieval outlaws. More importantly, they had training and experience in violence that civilian populations lacked, making resistance often futile, even when peasants outnumbered their attackers. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of bandit groups were remarkably sophisticated for their era. Bandits would often infiltrate communities disguised as traveling merchants, pilgrims, or laborers, gathering detailed information about local wealth, defenses, and travel patterns. Banditry documentation. They developed networks of informants who provided ongoing intelligence about potential targets and law enforcement activities. The psychological warfare employed by bandits was as effective as their physical violence. Stories of bandit atrocities spread rapidly through rural communities, creating a climate of fear that often made resistance seem hopeless. Medieval outlaws, bandits cultivated reputations for extreme violence to discourage opposition, understanding that fear was often more effective than actual force in achieving their objectives. The seasonal patterns of bandit activity followed the rhythms of medieval economic life. Harvest time brought increased bandit activity as criminals sought to intercept the movement of crops and seasonal wages. Banditry patterns. Winter months were particularly dangerous. because desperate bandits had fewer legitimate targets and were willing to take greater risks to obtain resources needed for survival. The relationship between bandits and local communities was complex and often involved elements of cooperation as well as conflict. Some bandit groups offered protection services to communities willing to pay tribute, creating feudal relationships that paralleled legitimate political structures. Medieval outlaws' villages might find it more economical to pay bandits for protection than to invest in their own defenses or rely on distant authorities for security. The territorial behavior of bandit groups created additional complications for peasant communities. Established bandit groups would defend their operational territories against competing criminals, sometimes resulting in violent conflicts that put civilian populations at risk. Banditry and wildlife peasants might find themselves caught between competing criminal organizations, each demanding tribute and threatening violence. The law enforcement response to banditry was often inadequate due to the limited resources and jurisdictional complications that characterized medieval government. Medieval outlaws. Local authorities might lack the military capability to confront well-armed bandit groups, while higher authorities were often too distant to provide timely assistance. This enforcement gap created spaces where criminal activity could flourish with minimal risk of legal consequences. The social origins of many bandits complicated community responses to criminal activity. Bandits were often local people who had been driven to crime by economic desperation, legal troubles, or social conflicts. Medieval outlaws. This meant that bandit groups might include relatives, former neighbors, or people with ongoing connections to the communities they victimized, creating moral and practical complications for both criminals and victims. The impact of banditry on medieval trade was devastating for rural communities that depended on commercial exchange for essential goods and services. Merchants would avoid routes known to be controlled by bandits, leaving entire regions isolated from broader economic networks. Dangers of travel. This isolation increased local prices for manufactured goods while reducing markets for agricultural products, creating economic hardship that often drove more people to criminal activity. The defensive strategies that communities developed in response to banditry revealed both the creativity and limitations of medieval security systems. Villages would organize watch systems, coordinate with neighboring communities for mutual assistance, and develop communication networks for sharing intelligence about criminal activity. Medieval village defense. However, these measures required resources and cooperation that were often difficult to maintain over extended periods. The weapons available to peasant communities for bandit defense were often inadequate for confronting professional criminals. Agricultural tools could serve as improvised weapons, but they were no match for military equipment in the hands of experienced fighters. Peasant defense weapons. Peasants who attempted armed resistance against bandits risked not just defeat, but retaliation that could destroy entire communities. The economic impact of bandit attacks extended far beyond the immediate loss of property or life. Families that lost their savings, livestock, or tools to bandits faced long-term consequences that could affect their survival for years. Economic impact of banditry. Unlike modern crime victims who might have insurance or government assistance, medieval peasants who were victimized by bandits had no recourse except their own resources and whatever charity their communities could provide. The psychological effects of living under constant threat of bandit attack created pervasive anxiety that shaped every aspect of medieval rural life. Families would modify their behavior, travel patterns, and economic activities to minimize their exposure to criminal predation. Fear of bandits. This defensive adaptation reduced productivity and quality of life while creating social isolation that weakened community bonds. The gender-specific aspects of bandit predation created particular horrors for medieval women who faced threats of sexual violence in addition to robbery and murder. Bandit attacks often involved systematic sexual assault as both a crime in itself and a weapon of terror designed to discourage resistance. Medieval women and violence. These attacks had lasting consequences not just for individual victims, but for entire communities that lived in fear of such violations. The religious implications of banditry created theological challenges similar to those posed by natural disasters or disease. How could a just God allow such evil to flourish among his people? Medieval theology and crime. The Church's response often involved interpreting bandit attacks as divine punishment for community sins, or as tests of faith, explanations that provided little practical comfort to victims of criminal violence. The interaction between banditry and other medieval dangers created cascading effects that multiplied threats to peasant survival. Communities under pressure from bandits became more vulnerable to disease, famine, and natural disasters because their resources and attention were diverted to security concerns. Multiple medieval threats. The stress and fear created by constant criminal threats weakened immune systems and community cooperation, making other survival challenges more difficult to overcome. But even as medieval peasant communities struggled to protect themselves against the very real threats posed by wolves and human predators, they faced a third category of danger that was perhaps more terrifying than either. The supernatural threats that they believed emerged from darkness itself, bringing with them powers that no earthly weapon or human strategy could effectively combat. What happened when the medieval night brought not just physical predators, but spiritual ones whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions about reality that governed medieval life? As the last light fades from the medieval sky, you hear the deep, resonant tone of the church bell beginning its evening toll. Not the joyful pealing that marks religious celebrations, but the solemn, measured strikes that announce the beginning of curfew. This is not merely a quaint medieval custom, but a life-saving institution that represented the difference between survival and death for countless peasant communities throughout Europe. The curfew bell system was one of the most sophisticated and effective community defense mechanisms ever developed for medieval rural security. Curfew bell Wikipedia. The word itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, reflecting its original purpose of signaling when hearth fires should be banked for the night. But by the high medieval period, the curfew bell had evolved into something far more complex, a coordinated system for mobilizing entire communities against the dangers that darkness brought. The timing of the curfew bell was carefully calculated to provide maximum protection while allowing essential activities to continue. Curfew bell history. The bell typically rang at 8 o'clock in the evening, giving families enough time to complete essential tasks while ensuring that coordinated community defenses were in place before the most dangerous hours of the night. This timing represented centuries of accumulated experience about when threats were most likely to materialize and when communities were most vulnerable to attack. The legal framework surrounding curfew was extensive and detailed, reflecting the seriousness with which medieval authorities regarded nighttime security. Curfew regulations. Under Norman law, the curfew bell created binding obligations for all community members. Fires had to be covered to prevent accidental blazes, doors had to be secured against intruders, and unauthorized movement outside dwellings was strictly forbidden except in emergencies. The enforcement mechanisms for curfew violations were severe enough to ensure compliance, even among those who might otherwise ignore the regulations. Medieval curfew. Enforcement penalties for breaking curfew could include fines, physical punishment, or even expulsion from the community, consequences that few medieval peasants could afford to risk. More importantly, curfew violations endangered the entire community by compromising coordinated defense systems. The watch system that activated with the curfew bell represented one of the most sophisticated examples of medieval community organization. Adult males would take turns serving as night watchmen, patrolling the perimeter of the village and monitoring for signs of approaching danger. Curfew and safety. These watches were organized with military precision, with designated routes, reporting procedures, and response protocols that had been refined through generations of dangerous experience. The communication systems that supported curfew enforcement were remarkably sophisticated for their technological limitations. Church bells could relay messages between communities over considerable distances, creating early warning networks that allowed villages to coordinate their responses to threats. Bell communication systems. A specific pattern of bell ringing might indicate wolf sightings, bandit activity, or other dangers that required immediate community response. The fire safety aspects of curfew regulations were equally important for community survival, as uncontrolled fires could destroy entire villages. Within minutes, medieval fire safety. The requirement to cover or extinguish all open flames after the curfew bell served multiple purposes: reducing the risk of accidental fires, eliminating light sources that might attract bandits or wolves, and ensuring that families were gathered safely in their dwellings before dangers emerged. The social dynamics of curfew created powerful community bonds that enhanced collective security in ways that individual family defenses never could. Community defense systems. When the curfew bell rang, every family knew that their neighbors were following the same security protocols, creating coordinated responses that multiplied the effectiveness of individual defensive measures. This community solidarity was essential for survival in an environment where isolated families had little chance against organized threats. The economic implications of curfew were substantial but generally accepted as necessary costs for community survival. Economic impact of curfew. Productive activities had to be compressed into daylight hours, reducing efficiency and limiting economic opportunities. However, the security benefits usually outweighed these costs, as communities that failed to maintain effective curfew systems often suffered catastrophic losses to bandit attacks or wolf predation. The technological innovations that developed around curfew systems demonstrated medieval ingenuity in working within severe resource constraints. Medieval innovations. Bell towers were positioned to maximize sound transmission across village territories. Warning systems used combinations of bell patterns, horn calls, and visual signals to communicate different types of threats. Emergency response procedures were developed to mobilize community defenses rapidly when threats materialized. The seasonal variations in curfew enforcement reflected the changing patterns of danger throughout the medieval year. Seasonal curfew patterns. Winter curfews were enforced more strictly and began earlier, reflecting the increased activity of wolves and the greater vulnerability of communities during cold months. Summer curfews might be relaxed slightly to allow for essential agricultural activities that extended into evening hours. The religious dimensions of curfew were deeply integrated into medieval Christian practice, reflecting the theological belief that darkness was the domain of evil forces. Religious aspects of curfew. The curfew bell often coincided with evening prayers, creating spiritual as well as physical protection against the dangers of night. Many communities would gather for collective prayers immediately after the curfew bell, seeking divine protection for the dangerous hours ahead. The class distinctions that affected curfew enforcement revealed the social hierarchies that characterized medieval society. Social class and curfew. Wealthy individuals might obtain exemptions or special permits that allowed them to move about after curfew, while peasants faced strict enforcement regardless of their personal circumstances. These distinctions created resentment but were generally accepted as part of the natural order of medieval society. The effectiveness of curfew systems can be measured by their persistence across centuries and their adoption throughout medieval Europe. Curfew effectiveness. Communities that maintained strict curfew discipline generally experienced lower rates of night attacks and fire disasters. The system was refined and improved over time, indicating that it provided genuine security benefits that justified its costs and inconveniences. The breakdown of curfew systems often preceded community disasters as relaxed discipline created vulnerabilities that predators quickly learned to exploit. Curfew breakdown. Villages that became careless about curfew enforcement would often experience sudden increases in bandit attacks, wolf predation, or fire disasters that reminded them painfully of why these systems had been developed. The communication protocols that activated during curfew emergencies were designed to provide rapid response while minimizing confusion and panic. Emergency protocols. Specific bell patterns indicated different types of threats, allowing communities to respond appropriately without wasting time on assessment and decision-making. These protocols were practiced regularly to ensure that emergency responses would be effective when real threats materialized. The psychological benefits of curfew systems were as important as their practical security functions. Psychological aspects. Knowing that the entire community was following coordinated security procedures provided reassurance that individual families could never achieve alone. The curfew bell created a sense of collective action against shared threats, strengthening community bonds while providing practical protection. The evolution of curfew systems over time reflected changing threat patterns and improving understanding of community defense. Curfew evolution. Early curfews focused primarily on fire prevention, but later systems incorporated responses to wolves, bandits, and other night dangers. The refinement of these systems over generations created increasingly effective protection against the various threats that darkness brought. Yet even as medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for protecting themselves against the physical dangers of wolves and bandits, they remained acutely aware that darkness brought threats far beyond anything that earthly defenses could address. The curfew bell that protected against human and animal predators was powerless against the supernatural dangers that medieval people believed emerged from the darkness itself. Forces that required entirely different forms of protection and represented threats to not just physical survival but spiritual salvation itself. What happened when the medieval night brought not just wolves and bandits but demons, ghosts, and supernatural entities whose very existence challenged the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead? As you huddle in your medieval dwelling, protected by curfew bells and community watch systems against wolves and bandits, you remain acutely aware that these earthly defenses offer no protection against the supernatural threats that medieval theology insisted were far more dangerous than any physical predator. According to the religious doctrine that shaped every aspect of medieval life, the darkness around your fragile circle of firelight teemed with invisible enemies engaged in an eternal war for human souls. Medieval Christianity taught that the supernatural world was populated by fallen angels, demons who had rebelled against God and been cast out of heaven to wage war against humanity. University of Reading Research. These were not the cartoonish devils of modern popular culture, but sophisticated, powerful beings with intelligence that exceeded human understanding and malice that was focused specifically on destroying the souls of individual Christians. Every peasant family understood that they were soldiers in a cosmic conflict that made earthly wars seem insignificant by comparison. The theological framework that explained demonic activity was elaborate and detailed, providing medieval people with a comprehensive understanding of how supernatural threats operated and why they were so dangerous. Medieval demons. According to church teaching, demons retained the intellectual powers they had possessed as angels, but had turned these abilities toward evil purposes. They could influence human thoughts, create illusions that deceived the senses, and manipulate physical objects in ways that appeared to violate natural law. The hierarchy of demonic forces was as complex and organized as any earthly military structure, with different categories of demons specializing in different types of spiritual warfare. Medieval superstitions. Some demons focused on tempting humans toward specific sins: pride, greed, lust, or wrath. Others specialized in creating despair, doubt, or fear that could lead Christians away from faith. The most powerful demons could possess human beings entirely, taking control of their bodies and souls for evil purposes. The timing of demonic activity was believed to follow patterns that made nighttime particularly dangerous for human souls. Darkness was considered the natural domain of evil forces when their power was strongest and human defenses were weakest. Medieval supernatural beliefs. The hours between midnight and dawn were especially perilous, as this was when demons were most active and most likely to attempt direct attacks on sleeping or vulnerable humans. The methods by which demons attacked humans were varied and sophisticated, reflecting their supernatural intelligence and their detailed knowledge of human weaknesses. They might appear in dreams to plant evil thoughts or create nightmares that would persist into waking hours. Sleep paralysis. Folklore. They could manipulate the environment to create sounds, movements, or apparitions that would terrify their victims or lead them into dangerous situations. Most insidiously, they could influence human thoughts so subtly that their victims believed the evil ideas were their own. The physical manifestations of demonic presence were documented in countless medieval accounts that were accepted as factual by both church authorities and common people. Medieval supernatural beliefs. Witnesses reported sudden temperature changes, unexplained sounds, objects moving without human intervention, and the appearance of shadowy figures that vanished when approached. These phenomena were not dismissed as imagination or misperception, but were understood as evidence of active supernatural warfare. The targeting strategies employed by demons were believed to focus particularly on vulnerable populations: children, the elderly, the sick, and those who were spiritually weak or morally compromised. Medieval demon beliefs. Peasant families understood that certain members of their households were at greater risk and required special protection through prayer. Religious objects and behavioral restrictions designed to minimize their exposure to supernatural attack. The geographical patterns of demonic activity were thought to concentrate around certain locations that were considered spiritually dangerous. Crossroads, abandoned buildings, sites of violent death, and areas associated with pagan worship were believed to attract demonic presence. Medieval supernatural geography. Peasant families would avoid these locations whenever possible, particularly during nighttime hours when supernatural dangers were most active. The seasonal variations in demonic activity followed patterns that medieval people learned to anticipate with dread. Winter months were considered particularly dangerous because the long hours of darkness provided more opportunities for supernatural attack. Medieval winter demons. Religious holidays and feast days were also times of heightened supernatural activity, as demons were believed to work harder to disrupt Christian celebrations and corrupt acts of worship. The relationship between demonic activity and natural disasters created additional layers of supernatural threat that peasant families had to consider. Storms, earthquakes, disease outbreaks, and other catastrophes were often interpreted as the result of demonic influence, or as opportunities for demons to attack communities when they were weakened by natural disasters. Medieval theology and disaster. This understanding meant that physical hardships were accompanied by spiritual dangers that required constant vigilance. The weapons available for spiritual warfare were entirely different from those used against physical threats, requiring knowledge and skills that many peasants possessed only imperfectly. Prayer was the primary defense, but it had to be performed correctly and with genuine faith to be effective. Medieval spiritual defense. Religious objects like crosses, holy water, and relics provided protection, but only if they had been properly blessed and were used with appropriate reverence. The role of the Church in providing spiritual protection was crucial but often inadequate for the needs of rural communities. Medieval church and supernatural priests could perform exorcisms, bless protective objects, and provide spiritual guidance, but many peasant communities were served by priests who visited infrequently or who lacked the specialized knowledge needed to combat serious supernatural threats. This left families largely dependent on their own spiritual resources during times of crisis. The folk practices that developed around supernatural defense often blended Christian doctrine with pre-Christian traditions that the Church officially condemned but often tolerated in practice. Folk magic and religion peasants would place protective charms in their homes, perform rituals designed to ward off evil influences, and use traditional remedies that were believed to have supernatural efficacy. These practices reflected the desperate need for protection against threats that Orthodox Christianity acknowledged but could not always effectively combat. The psychological impact of living in constant awareness of supernatural threats was profound and shaped every aspect of medieval peasant consciousness. Medieval mentality. Every unexplained sound, every disturbing dream, every piece of bad luck might be evidence of demonic attack. This hypervigilance created chronic stress that affected both mental and physical health, but it was considered essential for spiritual survival in a world where supernatural warfare was a daily reality. The social dynamics of supernatural threats created community responses that paralleled those developed for physical dangers. Families would share information about supernatural experiences, provide mutual support during times of spiritual crisis, and coordinate protective rituals that were believed to strengthen community defenses against demonic attack. Community, spiritual defense. These collective responses created social bonds while providing practical assistance for dealing with supernatural emergencies. The documentation of supernatural encounters in medieval records reveals the extent to which these beliefs shaped official as well as popular culture. Medieval supernatural documentation church authorities recorded accounts of demonic possession, miraculous interventions, and supernatural phenomena with the same attention to detail that they applied to legal proceedings or economic transactions. These records were not considered folklore or superstition, but factual accounts of spiritual warfare that required official response. The educational systems that taught people to recognize and respond to supernatural threats were as important as any practical training they might receive. Medieval supernatural education. Children learned to identify signs of demonic presence, understand the spiritual significance of dreams and visions, and perform the prayers and rituals that were their primary defense against supernatural attack. This education was considered essential for survival in a world where spiritual threats were more dangerous than physical ones. But the fallen angels who had been cast out of heaven were only one category of supernatural threat that medieval peasants believed they faced during the long hours of darkness. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was far more permeable in medieval understanding than modern people can easily comprehend, allowing the deceased to return in forms that were often more terrifying than any demon. What happened when darkness brought not just the enemies of God, but the restless dead themselves? Spirits of those who had died but could not find peace, returning to terrorize the living with powers and knowledge that transcended the natural world. As you lie in your medieval dwelling, having protected yourself as best you can against demons and fallen angels, you face an even more personal and terrifying category of supernatural threat: the spirits of the dead who refused to remain in their graves. These were not the vague, ethereal ghosts of modern ghost stories, but powerful, malevolent entities with detailed knowledge of the living world and personal grievances that drove them to return from death itself. Medieval understanding of death and the afterlife created a framework in which the return of the dead was not just possible, but inevitable under certain circumstances. University of Reading research. According to contemporary belief, souls that died with unfinished business, unconfessed sins, or violent emotions could become trapped between the world of the living and their final destination, creating revenants who possessed both supernatural powers and intimate knowledge of their former communities. The most terrifying aspect of these returning spirits was their personal connection to the living communities they haunted. Unlike demons, who were foreign entities with no understanding of local relationships and customs, revenants were former neighbors, family members, or community figures who retained their memories and personalities while gaining supernatural abilities. Medieval revenants. They knew exactly which living people had wronged them, where their enemies were vulnerable, and how to exploit local fears and social tensions for maximum psychological impact. The physical descriptions of revenants in medieval accounts reveal creatures that were far more substantial and dangerous than ethereal spirits. These entities were described as having physical bodies that could interact with the material world, opening doors, moving objects, and even engaging in physical violence against the living, Wiedergänger. However, these bodies showed clear signs of death and decay, creating an appearance that was simultaneously familiar and horrifying to those who had known them in life. The motivations that drove the dead to return were varied, but consistently focused on unresolved issues from their earthly existence. Some revenants sought revenge against those who had wronged them during life. Others returned to reclaim property or possessions that they felt had been unjustly taken from them. Medieval ghost motivations. Still others were driven by powerful emotions, love, hate, or guilt, that were so intense they prevented the soul from moving on to its eternal destination. The timing of revenant activity followed patterns that medieval people learned to anticipate with particular dread. The newly dead were most likely to return during the first few weeks after burial, when their ties to the earthly world were still strong and their souls had not yet accepted their new state. Medieval death beliefs. Anniversary dates of death were also dangerous times when the spiritual boundary between life and death was considered particularly weak. The locations where revenants appeared were predictably connected to their earthly lives and deaths. The homes where they had lived, the sites where they had died, and the graves where they were buried were all considered dangerous areas where encounters with the returning dead were most likely to occur. Medieval supernatural geography families would avoid these locations whenever possible, particularly during nighttime hours when supernatural activity was most intense. The methods by which revenants attacked the living were both physical and psychological, combining supernatural powers with intimate knowledge of their victims' weaknesses. They might appear in dreams to deliver threatening messages or create terrifying visions that would persist into waking hours. Medieval dream beliefs. They could manipulate physical objects to create disturbances that would terrorize entire households. Most seriously, they were believed capable of causing illness, accidents, and even death through supernatural influence. The community response to revenant activity required coordinated action that went far beyond individual family defenses. When a revenant was believed to be active, the entire community might be mobilized to identify the source of the problem and take appropriate action. Medieval community defense. This often involved examining recent deaths to identify which deceased person might have returned, investigating their motivations, and determining what actions would be necessary to put the spirit to rest. The investigation. Procedures used to identify active revenants were systematic and detailed, reflecting the seriousness with which medieval communities regarded these threats. Witnesses would be interviewed to determine the exact nature of supernatural manifestations, the timing of incidents, and any patterns that might indicate which dead person was responsible. Medieval supernatural investigation. These investigations were conducted with the same attention to detail that would be applied to legal proceedings or criminal cases. The remedial actions taken against active revenants were often extreme and reflected the desperate need to end supernatural attacks that could terrorize entire communities. In some cases, graves would be opened and the bodies of suspected revenants would be examined for signs of supernatural activity. Medieval grave opening. If the corpse appeared to be preserved unnaturally or showed signs of movement, it might be dismembered, burned, or subjected to other procedures designed to prevent its return. The religious responses to revenant activity involved both official church procedures and folk practices that blended Christian doctrine with traditional beliefs. Priests might perform special masses for the dead, conduct exorcisms, or bless graves with holy water and other sanctified materials. Medieval religious response. However, the Church's official position on revenants was sometimes at odds with popular beliefs, creating tension between orthodox doctrine and practical community needs. The psychological impact of revenant activity on medieval communities was devastating and long-lasting. Unlike attacks by demons or other supernatural entities, revenant hauntings involved personal relationships and community dynamics that made them particularly traumatic. Medieval community trauma families might find themselves terrorized by deceased relatives, while communities had to confront the possibility that their recently deceased neighbors had become malevolent enemies. The social dynamics of revenant cases often revealed underlying tensions and conflicts within medieval communities. Accusations of supernatural activity might reflect real grievances between families or individuals, while the investigation of revenant cases could expose secrets and resentments that had been hidden during the deceased person's lifetime. Medieval social dynamics. These revelations could have lasting effects on community relationships and social stability. The preventive measures that communities developed to reduce the risk of revenant activity reflected both religious belief and practical psychology. Proper burial procedures were considered essential for ensuring that the dead remained in their graves, while careful attention to the spiritual needs of dying persons was believed to reduce the likelihood of their return. Medieval burial practices. Families would make special efforts to ensure that their deceased relatives died with all their earthly affairs properly settled. The seasonal patterns of revenant activity followed rhythms that medieval people learned to anticipate with particular attention to community security. Winter months were considered especially dangerous because the long hours of darkness provided more opportunities for supernatural manifestations, while the stress of cold and food shortages might create conditions that made revenant returns more likely. Medieval seasonal supernatural religious holidays were also times of heightened vigilance, as these were occasions when the boundary between life and death was considered particularly permeable. The documentation of revenant cases in medieval records reveals the extent to which these beliefs influenced both popular culture and official institutions. Church authorities, legal officials, and community leaders recorded accounts of supernatural activity with the same attention to detail that they applied to other significant events. Medieval documentation. These records were not considered folklore or superstition, but factual accounts of supernatural phenomena that required official response and community action. But even as medieval communities developed elaborate procedures for dealing with revenants and other spirits of the human dead, they remained aware that the supernatural world contained entities that were far older and more alien than any human soul. The pre-Christian spirits that had inhabited the European landscape for millennia continued to assert their presence during the dark hours, bringing with them powers and motivations that even the most learned theologians struggled to understand or combat. What happened when the medieval night brought encounters not with the Christian dead or fallen angels, but with the ancient spirits of forest, field, and stream that had ruled the darkness since long before the first church bell ever rang across the European countryside? As you huddle in your medieval dwelling, having considered the threats posed by demons and revenants, you become aware of an even more ancient and alien category of supernatural danger: the pre-Christian spirits that had inhabited the European landscape for millennia before Christianity arrived, and who continued to assert their dominion over the wild places that lay beyond the fragile circle of human civilization. These entities, known by various names including elves, fairies, nature spirits, and wild folk, represented powers that were fundamentally different from either demons or human ghosts. University of Reading research. They were neither fallen angels nor deceased humans, but original inhabitants of the natural world who possessed their own agendas, their own forms of intelligence, and their own complex relationships with the human communities that had encroached upon their ancient territories. The theological status of these beings created significant challenges for medieval Christian doctrine, which struggled to categorize entities that clearly existed but didn't fit neatly into biblical frameworks. Medieval fairy beliefs. Some church authorities classified them as demons in disguise, while others suggested they might be neutral spirits that could be either helpful or harmful, depending on how humans interacted with them. This theological uncertainty left medieval peasants largely dependent on folk traditions and personal experience for guidance in dealing with these entities. The physical descriptions of these beings varied widely depending on local traditions and individual encounters, but they consistently portrayed entities that were simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Medieval supernatural creatures. Some appeared almost human, but with subtle differences: unusual height or size, strange coloring, or clothing that seemed to belong to no known fashion. Others were clearly non-human, but possessed intelligence and personality that distinguished them from ordinary animals. The territorial behavior of these ancient spirits was one of their most consistent and important characteristics from the perspective of medieval peasants trying to survive in a landscape that contained numerous invisible inhabitants. Folk territorial spirits. Certain areas, ancient forests, stone circles, springs, crossroads, and other sites with pre-Christian significance were understood to be under the protection or control of specific spirits who would defend their territories against human intrusion. The temporal patterns of spiritual activity followed cycles that often predated Christian calendar systems, creating additional layers of supernatural danger that peasant families had to navigate carefully. Medieval seasonal spirits. Certain times of year, particularly the transition periods between seasons, were considered especially dangerous for encounters with these ancient powers. The nights around pagan holidays that had been imperfectly converted to Christian celebrations remained times when the boundary between the human and spirit worlds was considered particularly permeable. The motivations that drove these spirits to interact with humans were complex and often incomprehensible to medieval people who tried to understand them within Christian frameworks. Spirit motivations. Some spirits seemed to seek entertainment or companionship from humans, leading to accounts of people being invited to join fairy revels or otherworldly celebrations. Others appeared to be protecting their territories or resources from human encroachment. Still others seemed to act from pure malice or amusement at human suffering. The methods by which these spirits interacted with humans were varied and unpredictable, making them particularly difficult to defend against using conventional protective measures. Spirit interaction methods. They might lead travelers astray using false lights or confusing paths. They could steal human children and replace them with changeling substitutes. They were capable of influencing human emotions and behavior in subtle ways that might not be recognized until significant damage had been done. The abduction narratives that surrounded these entities were among the most terrifying supernatural threats that medieval families faced, particularly because they involved the loss of family members to powers that operated according to alien logic. Medieval abduction stories. People who vanished mysteriously might be assumed to have been taken by spirits either permanently or for extended periods, during which they would experience time differently than those who remained in the human world. The protective measures that medieval communities developed against these ancient spirits were complex combinations of Christian practices and pre-Christian traditions that the Church often tolerated despite official disapproval. Folk protection methods. Iron objects were believed to repel many types of spirits, leading to the placement of iron nails, horseshoes, and other metal items around doorways and windows. Certain plants and herbs were considered protective, while specific prayers and rituals were believed to create barriers against spiritual intrusion. The negotiation strategies that developed for dealing with territorial spirits reflected the understanding that these entities could be influenced through proper protocols and offerings, even if they couldn't be controlled or eliminated. Spirit negotiation. Peasants might leave food offerings at sites associated with spirits, perform specific rituals before entering their territories, or follow traditional procedures designed to gain permission for activities that might otherwise provoke supernatural retaliation. The geographical knowledge that peasants required for supernatural safety involved detailed understanding of which locations were associated with spirit activity and how to safely navigate through or around these dangerous areas. Supernatural geography. Certain paths through forests were considered safe while others were avoided entirely. Specific landmarks might be associated with particular spirits who required special treatment or offerings. Water sources in particular were often considered to be under spiritual protection that required careful respect. The seasonal rituals that communities maintained for spiritual protection often combined Christian observances with much older traditions that predated the arrival of Christianity. Seasonal protection rituals. These ceremonies were designed to maintain proper relationships with the spiritual inhabitants of the landscape while ensuring divine protection against supernatural threats. The timing and content of these rituals reflected generations of accumulated experience about when and how spiritual dangers were most likely to manifest. The educational traditions that taught people to recognize and respond to spiritual encounters were passed down through families and communities using stories, warnings, and practical guidance that had been refined over centuries. Supernatural education. Children learned to identify signs of spiritual presence, understand the protocols for safe interaction with supernatural entities, and recognize the warning signs that indicated when spiritual encounters were becoming dangerous. The role of specialized practitioners, wise women, cunning men, and other individuals with particular knowledge of supernatural matters was crucial for communities that faced spiritual threats beyond the expertise of ordinary peasants or local priests. Medieval magical practitioners. These individuals possessed knowledge of protective rituals, healing practices, and communication techniques that could be essential during supernatural emergencies. The Church's response to persistent folk beliefs about ancient spirits was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the difficulty of eliminating beliefs that were deeply embedded in local culture and appeared to have practical utility for community survival. Church response to folk beliefs. While officially condemning traffic with spirits as potentially demonic, church authorities often tolerated practices that seemed to reduce supernatural problems without explicitly challenging Christian doctrine. The documentation of encounters with ancient spirits in medieval records reveals the extent to which these beliefs influenced daily life and community decision-making. Medieval spirit documentation. Legal proceedings might consider supernatural factors in determining guilt or innocence. Economic decisions might be influenced by spiritual considerations. Marriage arrangements might take into account the supernatural histories of different families or locations. The psychological impact of living in a world populated by invisible inhabitants was profound and shaped medieval consciousness in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Medieval supernatural psychology. Every unexplained event, every piece of bad luck, every strange encounter might be evidence of spiritual activity that required careful interpretation and appropriate response. This constant awareness of supernatural presence created a worldview in which the visible world was only a small part of a much larger and more complex reality. The integration of supernatural beliefs with practical survival strategies demonstrates how medieval peasants developed coherent systems for navigating a world that was understood to contain multiple levels of reality and numerous categories of intelligent beings. Medieval worldview integration. Physical dangers, like wolves and bandits, required physical responses, but spiritual dangers required spiritual defenses, and the wise peasant understood that survival depended on maintaining adequate protection against all categories of threat. As dawn finally breaks over the medieval landscape and you prepare to face another day of survival challenges, you carry with you the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned to navigate a world where darkness brought not just the absence of light, but the presence of dangers that transcended the natural world entirely. The terror that medieval peasants felt as sunset approached was not simply fear of the unknown, but informed awareness of genuine threats that required constant vigilance, community cooperation, and faith in protections, both earthly and divine. The medieval night was not empty darkness, but a crowded landscape of competing intelligences, conflicting powers, and ancient enmities that made every hour between sunset and dawn a test of survival that went far beyond mere physical endurance. In understanding why medieval peasants were terrified of the dark, we glimpse a worldview in which the boundary between the natural and supernatural was not a matter of belief, but of daily, lived experience that shaped every aspect of human existence. The fires that medieval peasants tended so carefully, the bells that rang out curfew warnings across rural communities, and the prayers that were whispered in the darkness were not quaint historical customs, but essential technologies for survival. In a world where darkness brought dangers that no modern person could easily imagine or fully comprehend, their terror of the night was not ignorance but wisdom, not superstition, but practical knowledge gained through centuries of deadly experience with the forces that emerge when light fails and human civilization becomes a tiny island of warmth and safety in an ocean of supernatural threat.